It was a ticklish position and genuine work, for the wood was hard and the hatchet dull. I stood below, holding the carving knife. We hadn't many tools on the ranch, and as the boy worked he entertained me with an account of an accident that happened years before, when his brother had chopped off a branch and the axe head had glanced off, striking the head of the boy who was watching below. I stood from under as he finished his story, and inquired with interest if he were sure his axe head was tight. Before the lad had made much impression on the hard sycamore, he got so tired and looked so white around the mouth that I insisted on his getting down to rest, and tried to divert him by calling his attention to the sunset and the voices of the quail calling from the vineyard. When he went up again, I handed him the carving knife to slice off the thinner wood on the edge of the nest hole, warning him not to cut off the heads of the young birds. At last the hole was big enough, and sticking the hatchet and knife into the bark, the lad threw one arm around the trunk to hold on while he thrust his hand down into the nest. "My, what a deep hole!" he exclaimed. "I don't know as I can reach them now. They've gone to the bottom, they're so afraid." Nearly a foot down he had to squeeze, but at last he got hold of one bird and brought it out. "Drop him down," I cried. "I'll catch him," and held up my hands. The little bird came fluttering through the air. The second bird clung, frightened, to the boy's coat, but he loosened its claws and dropped it down to me. What would the poor old mother woodpecker have thought had she seen these first flights of her nestlings? I hurried the little scared brothers under my jacket, my best substitute for a hollow tree, and called "Chicka" to them in the most woodpecker-like tones I could muster. Then the boy shouldered the ladder, and I took the carving knife, and we trudged home triumphant. We had rescued the little prisoners from the tower. When we had taken them into the house, the woodpeckers called out, and the cats looked up so savagely that I asked the boy to take the birds home to his sister to keep till they were able to care for themselves. On examining them, I understood what the difference in their voices had meant. One of them poked his head out of the opening in my jacket where he was riding, while the other kept hidden away in the dark, and when they were put into my cap for the boy to carry home, the one with the weak voice disclosed a whitish bill, a bad sign for a bird, and its feeble head bent under so weakly that I was afraid it would die. 3 days later, when I went up to the lad's house, it was to be greeted by loud cries from the little birds. Though they were in a box with a towel over it, they heard all that was going on. Their voices were as sharp as their ears, and they screamed at me so imperatively that I hurried out to the kitchen and rummaged through the cupboards till I found some food for them. They opened their bills and gulped it down as if starving, although their guardian told me afterwards that she had fed them 2 or 3 hours before. When held up where the wind could blow on them, they grew excited, and one of them flew down to the floor and hid away in a dark closet, sitting there as contentedly as if it reminded him of his tree-trunk home. I took the 2 brothers out into the sitting-room, and I kept them on my lap for some time, watching their interesting ways. The weak one I dubbed Jacob, which is the name the people of the valley had given the woodpeckers from the sound of their cries. The stronger bird I called Bairdi, as short for Melanerpes formicovorus bairdi, the name the ornithologists had given them. Jacob and Bairdi each had ways of his own. When offered a palm, Bairdi, who was quite like folks, was content to sit in it, but Jacob hung with his claws clasping a little finger, as a true woodpecker should. He took the same pose when he sat for his picture. Bairdi often perched in my hand, with his bill pointing to the ceiling, probably from his old habit of looking up at the door of his nest. Sometimes when Bairdi sat in my hand, Jacob would swing himself up from my little finger, coming bill to bill with his brother, when the small bird would open his mouth as he used to for his mother to feed him. Poor little orphans, they could not get used to their changed conditions. They did other droll things, just as their fathers had done before them. They used to screw their heads around owl fashion, a very convenient thing for wild birds who cling to tree trunks and yet need to know what is going on behind their backs. Once, on hearing a sudden noise, one of them ducked low and drew his head in between his shoulders in such a comical way we all laughed at him. I often went up to the ranch to visit them. We would take them out under a big spreading oak beside the house, where the little girl's mother sat with her sewing, and then watch the birds as we talked. When we put them on the tree trunk, at first they did not know what to do, but soon they scrambled up on the branches so fast their guardian had to climb up after them for fear they would get away. Poor little Jacob climbed as if afraid of falling off, taking short hops up the side of the tree, bending his stiff tail at a sharp angle under him to brace himself against the bark. Bertie, his stronger brother, was less nervous, and found courage to catch ants on the bark. Jacob did a pretty thing one day. When put up on the oak, he crept into a crack of the bark and lay there fluffed up against its sides with the sun slanting across, lighting up his pretty red cap. He looked so contented and happy it was a pleasure to watch him. Another time he started to climb up on top of my head, and, I dare say, was surprised and disappointed when what he had taken for a tree trunk came to an untimely end. When we put the brothers on the grass, one of them went over the ground with long hops, while the other hid under the rocking chair. One bird seemed possessed to sit on the white apron worn by the little girl's mother, flying over to it from my lap again and again. The woodpeckers had brought from the nest a liking for dark, protected places. Bertie twice clambered up in my hair and hung close under the brim of my black straw hat. Another time he climbed up my dress to my black tie, and fastening his claws on the silk, clung with his head in the dark folds as if he liked the shade. I covered the pretty pet with my hand, and he seemed to enjoy it. When I first looked down at him his eyes were open, though he kept very still, but soon his head dropped on my breast and he went fast asleep, and would have had a good nap if Jacob had not called and waked him up. Jacob improved so much after the first few days, and some doses of red pepper, that we had to look twice to tell him from his sturdy brother. He certainly ate enough to make him grow. The birds like best to be fed with a spoon, probably it seemed more like a bill. After a little they learned to peck at their food, a sign I hailed eagerly as indicative of future self-support, for with appetites of day laborers and no one to supply their wants, they would have suffered sorely, poor little orphans. Sometimes, when they had satisfied their first hunger, they would shake the bread from their bills as if they didn't like it and wanted food they were used to. When one got hungry he would call out, and then his brother would begin to shout. The little tots gave a crooning, gentle note when caressed, and a soft cry when they snuggled down in our hands or cuddled up to us as they had done under their mother's wing. Their call for food was a sibilant chirr, and they gave it much oftener than any of the grown-up woodpecker notes. But they also said "Chaw-caw" and rattled like the old birds. I was glad that there were two of them, so that they would not be so lonely. If separated, they showed their interest in each other. If Bertie called, Jacob would keep still and listen attentively, raising his topknot till every microscopic red feather stood up like a bristle, when he would answer Bertie in a loud, manly voice. It was amusing to see the small birds try to plume themselves. Sometimes they would take a sudden start to make their toilettes, and both work away vigorously upon their plumes. It was comical to see them try to find their oil glands. Had the old birds taught them how to oil their feathers while they were still in the nest? They were thickly feathered, but when they reached back to their tails, the pink skin showed between their spines and shoulders, giving a good idea of the way birds' feathers grow only in tracts. When the little princes were about a month old, I arranged with a neighboring photographer to have them sit for their picture. He drove over to the sycamore, and the lad who had rescued the prisoners took them down to keep their appointment. One of them tried to tuck its head up the boy's sleeve, being attracted by dark holes. While we were waiting for the photographer, the boy put Jacob in a hollow of the tree, where he began pecking as if he liked it. He worked away until he squeezed himself into a small pocket, and then, with his feathers ruffled up, sat there, the picture of content. Indeed, the little fellow looked more at home than I had ever seen him anywhere. The rescuer was itching to put the little princes back in their hole to see what they would do, but I wouldn't listen to it, being thankful to have gotten them out once. When Bertie was on the bark and Jacob was put below him, he turned his head, raised his red cap, and looked down at his brother in a very winning way. Soon the photographer came and asked, "Are these the little chaps that try to swallow your fingers?" We were afraid they would not sit still enough to get good likenesses, but we had taken the precaution to give them a hearty breakfast just before starting, and they were too sleepy to move much. In the picture, Jacob is clinging to the boy's hand in his favorite way, and Bertie is on the tree trunk. Mountain Billy pricked up his ears when he discovered the woodpeckers down at the sycamore, but he often saw them up at the ranch and took me to make a farewell call on them before I left for the east. We found the birds perched on the tobacco tree in front of the ranch house, with a tall step ladder beside it so the little girl could take them in at night. Their cup of bread and milk stood on the ladder, and when I called them, they came over to be fed. They were both so strong and well that they would soon be able to care for themselves, as their fathers had done before them. And when they were ready to fly, they might have help, for an old woodpecker of their family possibly an unknown uncle, had been seen watching